Charles Fraser. The Telltale Earring. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 10. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production. Tiffany Sanders trembled all over. Uncontrollable rage welled up inside her. At the same time, she was flooded with a fear she had never known before in her life. She felt, quite literally, backed into a corner. She could already feel against her back the mahogany chest of drawers that she and Conrad had bought together during their honeymoon in South America, which now adorned her husband's office. Then her stiletto heel caught in the expensive deep pile carpet. She had to be careful not to fall. He stood close to her with an angry face. He shouted at her, "You stupid thing! Who do you think you're dealing with?" She felt his spittle landing on her cheek. Disgust overcame her, but there was no time for that now. Bravely, she lifted her head and thrust her chin defiantly towards him. "I won't be blackmailed by you," she hissed at him combatively through clenched lips. Instantly came the slap to her left cheek. She hadn't seen the hand coming. She only felt the enormous force behind it. Without warning, it knocked her off balance. She fell. Her head struck the mahogany chest violently. "How's it looking, Holmes?" I asked my friend, the detective, as we sat together at the breakfast table, Holmes leafing through his morning paper whilst I was about to spread jam on my third piece of toast. "Are you planning to conduct another experiment and blow something up today, or will you join me for a spot of pensioners' yoga?" Holmes lowered his paper slightly, and his gaze peered straight at me over the top edge of the newspaper. "My dear colleague and valued friend, since you ask, I shall opt for the former and blow something up." I smirked and took a bite of my roll. "Holmes, you're gradually becoming rather stiff in your joints and hips. My daily yoga routine would certainly do you some good." "But dear Dr. Watson, a stiff limb is nothing to worry about, quite the contrary," Alice said with a smile, standing in the doorway. I jumped up in surprise. "Alice, firstly, it's not proper to sneak up on two elderly gentlemen like that, and secondly, it's even more improper to concern yourself with or even discuss other men's limbs." Alice put her hands on her hips and replied smugly, "Firstly, I didn't sneak up on you. I knocked 3 times. Next time, I'll ask a brass band to accompany me. And secondly, dear Dr. Watson, we've entered the 20th century. Don't be such a prude. Even Holmes found it amusing." My mouth hung open and my jam roll got stuck in my throat, while Holmes's eyes sparkled and his lips were still curled into a smile. "Alice, point taken." Alice performed a slight curtsy and continued, "Right then, gentlemen, joking aside, a Scotland Yard carriage is waiting for you both outside. Inspector Wolfford requests your presence on an urgent matter." Immediately, my friend put down his newspaper and rose from the breakfast table. Alice already had our coats and Holmes's hat ready and handed them to us. As Holmes slipped into his frock coat, he said, "Watson, it seems your joints will remain stiff for a while longer." "Holmes, I must protest," I exclaimed indignantly, standing still. But dear Alice doubled over with laughter, and Holmes had already linked arms with her as the two of them left the flat. I lingered for a brief moment. Had I truly become such a prude? But there were certain things a lady simply shouldn't speak of. I felt the blush of embarrassment creep across my face once again, decided to simply stop thinking about it, and hurried after Alice and Holmes. The young police constable who was chauffeuring us couldn't tell us any more about the matter requiring our presence than that it involved the murder of a wealthy woman. I looked out of the window and observed the area we were being taken to. "You're so quiet, Watson. Is something troubling you?" Holmes asked me. I shook my head. "Are you still in a huff?" Holmes pressed on. But before I could answer, we had already reached our destination. The automobile came to an abrupt halt. At once, the doors were opened for us. They seemed to have been eagerly awaiting our arrival. I lumbered out of the vehicle, and at that very moment saw Inspector Wolfford hurrying towards us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how lovely that you were able to arrange it at such short notice. the inspector greeted us. "Good day, Inspector," replied Holmes. "What can we do for you?" Inspector Wolfford got straight to the point. "This is truly a most delicate case. We have identified the deceased as Mrs. Tiffany Sanders." "Surely not Conrad Sanders' wife?" I exclaimed. Inspector Wolfford nodded gravely. "I'm afraid that's correct, Dr. Watson. Now you understand the urgency of this case." We understood all too well. Conrad Sanders, together with his brother Stuart, was one of London's wealthiest and most influential people. He owned numerous companies, factories, residential buildings, and so on and so forth. Over the years, he had built himself a proper empire, acquired through ruthless negotiation, courage, and presumably a fair bit of luck. How much of it was due to shady dealings, I couldn't say for certain, though crime and illegality surely played their part. There was no other way to explain such inconceivable wealth. "Please tell us what useful information you already have for us, and do let us take a look at the victim," Holmes requested matter-of-factly. Inspector Wolfford led us to the body while explaining the facts. "Tiffany Sanders, 34 years old. She was discovered here in the park this morning by a jogger who immediately alerted the police. Upon closer examination, I believe that Mrs. Sanders was not murdered here, and that this is merely where the body was found, not where the crime took place." "You couldn't find any murder weapon, blood spatter, or signs of a struggle?" asked Holmes. "No, Mr. Holmes. That's why I came to this conclusion. Additionally, the victim shows an injury to the back of her head, presumably caused by blunt force trauma." "What about valuables? Or rather, how were you able to identify Mrs. Sanders so quickly?" Holmes wanted to know. The deceased still had her handbag. It had been carelessly placed beside her. The wallet was missing its cash, but she still had her documents with her. They'd left her jewellery as well. At least, I couldn't detect any theft at first glance. The lady is still wearing 2 rings, a necklace, a bracelet, earrings and a brooch. Holmes scratched his chin. "It seems we can at least rule out a robbery. If only cash was taken, and most likely just for show, while the jewellery was forgotten." "Perhaps the perpetrator didn't get the chance," I interjected. "I mean, if he was possibly already surprised by that jogger." "You may well be right there, Watson, but that theory doesn't explain why the dead woman was merely deposited here rather than killed here. No, we can rule out robbery murder." By now, we were standing directly in front of the deceased Mrs. Sanders. At first glance, there was no sign of violence. Tiffany Sanders was as beautiful as ever. Her chestnut-coloured, chin-length hair framed her delicate face. But then, my gaze fell upon a blemish on her left cheek. Excitedly, I called out, "Holmes, have you seen this? What's that on her cheek?" Holmes bent over the body and raised his eyebrows. With a furrowed brow, he declared, "I'm not entirely certain. It almost appears as though she was struck before her death. However, that doesn't explain the small wound that may have been inflicted in the process." Holmes examined the injury for several more seconds before leaning on his walking stick and laboriously rising to his feet. "Have you already informed Mrs. Sanders's relatives about her death?" Holmes asked Inspector Wolfford. "Not yet. I thought perhaps you'd both like to be present. The initial reaction might help identify potential suspects." "Very well thought out," Holmes praised Inspector Wolfford. "I suggest we set off straight away." I had never been to the Sanders family estate before, but the first impression was overwhelming. As we drove up the long driveway from the gate to the castle-like residence, lined with countless ornamental shrubs, I didn't know which side of the motor car to look out of first. Deer, stags and hares roamed freely across the more than generous grounds. Stone sculptures, rose bushes and rock gardens were tastefully arranged. A small pond, adorned with green and red reeds and home to 2 swans and several ducks, completed the harmoniously designed garden. Though garden was certainly the wrong term, in no way justified for this unique expanse of greenery. The residence itself was built and furnished with at least as much style. A wide marble staircase led to the entrance, where a large double-rounded door was promptly opened by a household servant before we reached the final step. Inspector Wolfford introduced us, and we were led by the middle-aged lady, dressed in a properly fitted household uniform, into an enormous drawing room. I looked around with my mouth agape. No expense had been spared on gold and marble. However, it didn't feel oppressive or ostentatious. Each piece of furniture was artfully and tastefully showcased. The ceiling was more of a vault, with artistic paintings that even the Pope himself might have envied. A few minutes later, the maid returned with a tray of tea and biscuits, asked us to take a seat, and informed us that Mr. Sanders would be with us shortly. He did not keep us waiting long. "You're from the police?" he blurted out without greeting. Inspector Wolfford stepped towards the man, extending his right hand, and replied, "Scotland Yard, Inspector Wolfford's my name. The two gentlemen accompanying me are Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson." Mr. Sanders nodded briefly before continuing grumpily. "And to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit? Please be brief. I'm urgently occupied with other matters." "Please do sit with us for a moment," Inspector Wolfford requested. Surprised by this invitation in his own house, Mr. Sanders took a seat opposite Holmes and myself. "Let's get straight to the point," Inspector Wolfford began. "This is about your wife." Conrad Sanders's facial expression changed abruptly, and he suddenly seemed completely engaged. "What about her? Where is she?" he asked irritably. "What do you mean by that?" the inspector replied matter-of-factly. "She's not at home, simply vanished without a trace, and now you turn up at my doorstep mentioning my wife," Mr. Sanders concluded agitatedly. "I see," replied Inspector Wolfford. "Is it usual for your wife not to be at home at this hour?" "What are you thinking?" Mr. Sanders's face turned red, and he seemed to be almost shouting. "My wife is usually sitting at the breakfast table by now, or getting ready for the day. Tell me at once where my wife is." He slammed his fist on the table, making the teacups rattle. Inspector Wolfford seemed to gather his thoughts for a brief moment. Then he looked Conrad Sanders firmly in the eyes. "Mr. Sanders, I regret to inform you that your wife, Tiffany Sanders, appears to have fallen victim to murder." "My deepest condolences, Mr. Sanders." Conrad Sanders sat motionless. By now, his face had turned completely pale, and his anger, which moments ago had seemed to hang over him like a threatening storm cloud, had vanished. "She's supposed to be dead?" he stammered incomprehensibly. "How? When?" "Mr. Sanders, did your wife leave the house last night?" Inspector Wolfford interrupted Sanders's thoughts. "Tiffany? No, absolutely not. We had dinner together, then sat by the fireplace for a while, absorbed in our reading, until we said good night to each other at around 10 p.m. I stared at Conrad Sanders in bewilderment. "You said goodbye to each other?" "Tiffany and I have separate bedrooms. I snore very loudly and quite frequently," explained Mr. Sanders. "Nevertheless, I personally couldn't warm to the idea of wishing my wife good night before bedtime, and then each of us retiring to our own separate rooms, though this probably occurred quite frequently amongst the upper classes." "So you are absolutely certain that your wife did not leave the house after that?" Holmes now spoke up. "Absolutely. We are a strictly Christian household, and at 10 p.m. everything is locked up, the lights are turned off, and it's bedtime." Perhaps this dusty Christian household could do with a visit from Alice, I thought to myself. But suddenly the door was yanked open violently and another man entered the drawing room. "Conrad, what's going on here? Polly said these gentlemen are from the police?" Mr. Sanders cleared his throat briefly. "That's right, Stuart. Something terrible has happened. It's about Tiffany. She's said to be dead." "Dead? I don't understand," replied the man in disbelief. "If you would be so kind as to introduce us," Inspector Wolfford chimed in. "But of course. Please excuse me. Stuart, this is Inspector Wolfford from Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. Is that right? This is my brother Stuart." "Stuart, please do join us," said Inspector Wolfford, indicating a seat for Stuart Sanders. "When was the last time you saw your sister-in-law alive?" Stuart Sanders seemed to ponder briefly before coming up with an answer. I believe I saw Tiffany yesterday afternoon. And did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Sanders? Holmes pressed. Stuart Sanders's reply came promptly this time. No, there was nothing. Where did they actually find you? Conrad Sanders suddenly seemed to remember. I beg your pardon. Yes, of course. Mrs. Sanders was discovered by a jogger in Richmond Park, lying half concealed behind a bush. In Richmond Park? But how on earth did she end up there? Asked Conrad, agitated. Well, we're here to get to the bottom of that question, Holmes countered. Inspector Wolfford glanced at his wristwatch. Mr. Sanders, we would like to have a look around your house. Why in heaven's name do you want to spy on my house? Do you have a search warrant? Conrad Sanders burst out. His brother Stuart placed a calming hand on Conrad Sanders's arm and tried to soothe him. Inspector Wolfford replied, The cavalry will be at your doorstep any moment now, with the appropriate piece of paper in hand. I'm quite certain that, given the facts presented, any duty judge would have approved a search warrant. I wouldn't sign that if I were you. As soon as any judge in their right mind hears the good name Sanders, they'll back right off. But Inspector Wolfford remained unfazed. So you're accusing the relevant authorities and officials of bias, and don't believe that all people are equal before God and the law? Perhaps before God, but certainly not before the law. Conrad Sanders began to smile mockingly. And sadly, I had to agree with this unpleasant oaf on this point. Polly, the housemaid, entered again, announced a horde of policemen who were standing at the front door requesting entry, and simultaneously placed another cup of tea in front of Stuart Sanders. Now let the police do their job, Stuart earnestly urged his brother Conrad. After all, we do want to know what happened to your wife. Conrad Sanders nodded almost imperceptibly. Mr. Sanders, what did your wife occupy herself with all day long? Any obligations, hobbies, friends, family? Holmes wanted to know. Well, Tiffany certainly didn't have any friends. Her family lives in the USA. That means my brother and I are, or rather were, Tiffany's friends and family. Her obligation was to look after my well-being and take care of me. She also loved painting. You're welcome to look at some of her pictures. Oh yes, and she had recently taken up military fitness training. Military? I asked, baffled. Horse riding, Holmes clarified. Exactly, Conrad Sanders agreed. She had always had a certain affinity for horses, and eventing is truly extremely demanding for both horse and rider. Moreover, horse riding keeps one in excellent shape, he concluded. I specifically paid for training lessons 3 times a week for her. And which stables did Tiffany train at? Holmes inquired further. We have our own excellent stables, just behind the servants' quarters. Her trainer came here specially. Very well, said Inspector Wolfford. Mr. Holmes, would you be so kind as to join me with the search? And Dr. Watson, would you mind keeping these 2 gentlemen company in the meantime? I believe my disappointment was written all over my face. The prospect of whiling away time with the Sanders brothers was not particularly appealing. My 2 companions seemed to feel the same way, so the 3 of us began stirring the milk in our teacups simultaneously. Holmes gave me a sympathetic look before disappearing with Inspector Wolfford. A few minutes of silence later, Stuart Sanders began to stretch extensively and surprisingly spoke up. My limbs are feeling quite rusty and stiff. What's wrong with stiff limbs? I asked Stuart, hoping to lighten the mood a bit. Appalled, almost disgusted, Stuart Sanders stared straight at me. I cleared my throat apologetically and quickly lowered my gaze. Apparently, I wasn't the only prudish person in this room. Should I tell Alice about this? The minutes passed agonizingly slowly, accompanied by an icy silence, until Holmes and Inspector Wolfford finally returned. Dr. Watson, would you be so kind as to accompany me? The riding instructor has just arrived, and I would like to have a word with him. I promptly rose from the thoroughly comfortable armchair, albeit so vigorously that I knocked it right over. Embarrassed, I quickly set it upright again and could hardly wait to escape this room. Holmes and I strolled away from the manor house, heading towards the servants' quarters and stables. Were you able to follow any relevant conversations between the brothers during your wait? Holmes inquired. I whistled contemptuously through my lips. You have absolutely no idea. This would be my only comment about those torturous minutes that felt like an eternity. After a short while, we reached the stable building. We looked around, but couldn't spot anyone. So we walked straight into the stable. We were warmly greeted by hearty neighing, which made both Holmes and myself smile involuntarily. At the far end, there was a horse in the stable aisle, tied to one of the box doors. We walked towards the horse until we could make out a young man who was picking the large black stallion's hooves. Are you Tiffany Sanders' riding instructor? Who wants to know? The man retorted sharply. I beg your pardon. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my partner, Dr. Watson. Well? Yes, I'm Rick Hunter. What can I do for you? Well, Holmes continued hesitantly, I'm afraid I don't know to what extent you've been informed. She's dead, isn't she? Rick Hunter said, as he released the horse's hoof with his right hand and rose to his full, imposing height. Yes, Holmes answered curtly. I had a feeling it might be something like that, Hunter said, almost sadly, as he moved on to the horse's next hoof. Probably to avoid having to look us in the eye any longer, I concluded. What makes you think so? Asked Holmes. All the police. Something terrible must have happened if Sanders is tolerating so many officers on his property. Besides, Tiff is usually already in the stable when I arrive. Tiff? Said Holmes shrewdly. You liked her? Rick Hunter remained motionless for a moment, then lifted his head and looked Holmes straight in the eyes. Yes, I did. Very much so. You had an affair. This wasn't a question, but rather a statement that Holmes made. Hunter sincerely confirmed this as well. When did you last see Tiffany Sanders, and did you notice anything unusual about her? Holmes pressed on. 2 days ago. We had our last military riding lesson. We rode together to the training grounds. To be honest, we didn't practice much. I had prepared a picnic. We sat together on the blanket, ate, laughed, and we let the horses graze and enjoyed the lovely weather. No, Tiff was just like her usual self. Would you allow me one final question? Are you left-handed? Somewhat confused, Hunter looked at his left hand, then replied, Yes, I am. To what extent is this relevant? Surely I'm not a suspect. Keep calm, Holmes tried to reassure him. I only asked you that question for the sake of completeness. You are not among my suspects. Rick Hunter breathed a noticeable sigh of relief. Well, that's good then, though sadly it won't bring Tiff back to life. My sincere condolences, said Holmes, patting young Rick Hunter encouragingly on the shoulder. Holmes and I left the stable in silence. A few hours later, Inspector Wolfford called on us at our flat in Baker Street. I poured the inspector an equally generous glass of brandy, whilst Holmes sat in his armchair, puffing thoughtfully on his cigar. Wolfford sipped his glass and sank back exhaustedly into his armchair. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, may I ask for your assessment? My gaze fell expectantly upon Holmes, for he had not yet shared his thoughts on the matter with me either. Holmes took another deep drag on his cigar. Mrs. Tiffany Sanders was killed in the heat of the moment. You remember the injury on her left cheek? I'm certain she was struck and the injury came from a ring. This means the perpetrator must have hit her with the back of their hand to leave such an abrasion on Mrs. Sanders's cheek, which in turn means that the perpetrator must be left-handed. But what makes you think that? I asked Holmes. My dear Dr. Watson, please stand facing me. Holmes immediately rose from his armchair, and I stood eye to eye with my friend. Then he demonstratively raised his right hand. Look, he said, and drew back for a strike. His right hand landed on my cheek with a smack. Ouch! I cried out. Do you always hit quite so hard when demonstrating a point? Oh, don't be so sensitive, Watson. Rather tell me which cheek you're clutching so painfully. I noticed the ironic undertone in his voice perfectly well, but merely replied meekly, The right one. Precisely correct. If I strike you with the back of my right hand so that my ring can leave a wound, then I hit you on the right cheek. However, if I strike you with the back of my left hand, Then I hit your left cheek." "Thank you for demonstrating that so impressively," I said, still rubbing my right cheek. Holmes settled back into his favourite armchair and continued. "We now know that our perpetrator is left-handed. This applies to 3 men. The riding instructor, Hunter," I interjected. "But who else?" "Have you not been paying proper attention, Watson?" Holmes scolded me. "You've been sitting with the Sanders brothers for what feels like an eternity, drinking tea, and you failed to notice that both gentlemen are left-handed?" I thought for a moment. The image came back to me of all 3 of us stirring our teacups. "That's right. And both men wear a large ring on their left hand." "Very good, Watson. If I observed correctly, those rings are signet rings, most likely family heirlooms from long-forgotten days. Thus, we have already managed to reduce the number of suspects from 3 to 2. "But aren't you jumping to conclusions a bit too hastily?" the inspector interjected. "What about the riding instructor? You said he's left-handed as well." "But he doesn't wear a ring," replied Holmes. But Inspector Wolfford persisted. "But couldn't he have taken it off?" "Theoretically correct, practically wrong. You haven't seen the riding instructor's hands, weather-beaten, marked by working with the animals. If Rick Hunter normally wore a ring and had recently removed it, one would have been able to see the pale strip that the piece of jewellery would have left on his finger," Holmes explained. "That means we have 2 possible suspects," I pondered. "Then it's actually quite clear. Tiffany Sanders was having an affair with the riding instructor. Her husband, Conrad Sanders, found out and killed her." "It could be possible," said Holmes. "But we still don't know where Mrs Sanders was murdered and how she ended up in the park," Inspector Wolfford pointed out. "Hopefully the autopsy will provide us with further insights," I said. Inspector Wolfford rose. "Mr Holmes, Dr Watson, it has been a long day. Thank you for your assistance, but I shall take my leave now. Should any new facts come to light during the course of tomorrow, I will inform you accordingly." "Good night, Inspector," said Holmes, while taking another draw on his cigar. Holmes seemed to be completely lost in his thoughts once again, so I too made my way to bed. Late in the afternoon of the following day, Inspector Wolfford paid us another visit. "I hope you come bearing good news, Inspector," Holmes greeted him. "I'm afraid not, Mr Holmes. The autopsy hasn't yielded any further insights. Tiffany Sanders died from a skull fracture, as evidenced by the wound on the back of her head." "Was she struck down?" I asked. "The autopsy report only states blunt force trauma," Inspector Wolfford replied. "I don't believe Mrs Sanders was struck down. It doesn't fit the picture. Do consider that she was first slapped across the face. I'm much more convinced that this caused her to lose her balance, fall, and hit the back of her head so unfortunately that she immediately sustained a skull fracture." "That sounds plausible," Inspector Wolfford agreed with Holmes, "which in turn strengthens the suspicion against her husband, Conrad Sanders. Let's assume he discovered the affair, confronted his wife about it, struck her in the face, and well, we know the rest." "Is that enough for an indictment?" I asked the inspector. "I'm afraid not, Dr Watson. Nothing but speculation and circumstantial evidence. We lack the proof, and unfortunately, I have more bad news. The pathology department has already released Mrs Sanders's body." "So quickly?" I asked. "The autopsy report sounds more than vague." "I'm afraid you're right. I also think this process has been expedited by someone. The funeral is taking place tomorrow," announced Inspector Wolfford. Holmes grunted, biting his lips. "I assume you will be attending the funeral, Inspector?" Wolfford nodded. "But of course." "Then please take good Dr Watson with you. As they say, 4 eyes see more than 2. Perhaps you'll notice something else." "What are you planning, Holmes?" I asked, for I knew only too well that telltale glint in my friend's eyes. "Meanwhile, I shall return to the Sanders home and question the servants. I've just had a thought." Of course, there was nothing more to be got out of Holmes. Shortly after noon the following day, I had arranged to meet Inspector Wolfford at the main entrance of the central cemetery. More and more mourners arrived one after another, high-ranking figures from London's business world, and finally the bereaved family themselves. Inspector Wolfford and I observed the scene from a park bench, somewhat removed from the proceedings. Everything had proceeded without notable incident until Rick Hunter, Tiffany Sanders's riding instructor, suddenly arrived. A noticeable unease swept through the Sanders brothers. However, Hunter kept discreetly to the background, and nothing more than a few dirty looks were exchanged, presumably to avoid stirring up any unnecessary scandal. Dejected, Inspector Wolfford and I soon returned to Baker Street and eagerly awaited Holmes's arrival. We did not have to wait too long for Holmes. He naturally wanted to avoid an encounter with the Sanders brothers and therefore left the estate early. "You don't exactly look as though your endeavour was crowned with success," he remarked, almost mockingly, as he rid himself of his coat, sank into the armchair, and rummaged for his pipe. "You might be right about that," I admitted ruefully, "which is why we are all the more eager to hear about your successes." "Indeed," said Holmes, taking a draw from his pipe. "The renewed visit to the Sanders house proved to be most enlightening, particularly as yesterday, quite suddenly, a thought occurred to me. You both remember the charming painting of Tiffany Sanders that hung in the drawing-room? And Inspector Wolfford," Holmes continued straight away without even waiting for our response. "In Tiffany Sanders's bedchamber, there were 3 more portraits of her hanging as well. Did you notice anything about them?" It was clearly evident that the inspector hadn't the faintest idea what Holmes was getting at. Therefore, good old Holmes didn't waste much time and said, "In every single portrait, Tiffany wore the same earrings. I asked the housemaid, Polly, about the significance of these earrings. She told me that the diamond studs were a wedding gift from Conrad Sanders to his wife. She apparently loved them and thus never took them off. Not for sleeping, not for bathing, absolutely never." After my conversation with Polly, I continued strolling around the estate until I finally reached the garage. 4 carriages and 1 motor car were inside, so I turned to Polly again, who told me that this was Conrad Sanders's vehicle. "Stuart Sanders's motor car has been in the workshop for nearly a week. He apparently crashed into something and there was rather serious body damage. Of course, the Sanders brothers own other vehicles. However, these are kept at the company headquarters and are used exclusively for business purposes. What do you say?" Holmes's eyes sparkled and his face beamed, but for the life of me, I couldn't see how this would help us move forward. Inspector Wolfford felt the same way. Holmes looked at us expectantly, but the inspector and I remained silent. Holmes took a deep breath and visibly tried to maintain his composure. "Inspector Wolfford, you have read the complete autopsy report and written the police report. Can you recall whether Tiffany Sanders was wearing the earrings at the time of her murder?" "Yes, she did. I conducted and documented the inventory myself," replied the inspector. "Have the earrings been handed over to the next of kin?" Holmes continued. "No, certainly not," Wolfford dutifully replied. "The body was released so quickly that I personally took possession of Mrs Sanders's personal valuables." "Excellent!" Holmes clapped his hands with delight. "Now we can spring the trap." "What trap?" I asked. Holmes shook his head in disbelief at my level of incomprehension. "Tiffany Sanders was most certainly murdered at home after 10 p.m. Afterwards, the perpetrator must have moved the body into the car, driven to the park, and placed the corpse behind the bushes. Before that, he had taken her handbag, which he arranged next to the deceased, to make it appear as though Tiffany Sanders had been out and about. He took her cash to make it look like a robbery murder. But why did he leave her papers? That way we were able to identify the dead woman as Tiffany Sanders straight away, I wanted to know. Firstly, what would a murderous thief want with documents? And secondly, Tiffany Sanders is as well known in this city as a sore thumb. Even you recognised her straight away without any identification. So it made no difference. "Let's get back to your snapping trap, Mr. Holmes," Inspector Wolfford interrupted us, visibly tense. Holmes didn't need to be told twice. "Inspector, right after our conversation, you will pay another visit to the Sanders brothers. You'll inform them that only 1 earring was found on the body. Let them know that at this very moment police officers are combing through the site in the park again, searching for the second earring. If it isn't found, tell them the police will search the Sanders estate again tomorrow. Meanwhile, Watson and I will sneak into the garage, place an earring in the car boot and hide. Only the murderer will search tonight, first at the crime scene, which we unfortunately don't know exactly, and then in the boot of the car he used to transport the body, looking for the missing earring. After all, he'll want to find it before the police supposedly arrive tomorrow. Inspector Wolfford leapt up with an euphoric exclamation. "Holmes, you're brilliant! We've got him!" "Holmes, your brilliant plan could do with some improvement," I grumbled, after we had been sitting hunched over in a carriage for no less than 4 hours, parked right next to the automobile in the Sanders garage. We had long since planted the earring in said vehicle and were now waiting anxiously. I admit that a cushion, blankets, and something to eat and drink would have made our surveillance job more comfortable. But what kind of detectives would we be if we had to lug around an entire camping kit for that purpose? We would be 2 detectives who weren't thirsty and hungry, who weren't cold, and whose every old bone wasn't aching. "Shh, Watson, I hear something," Holmes hissed. And indeed, very slowly and carefully the garage door opened. A shadowy figure emerged hesitantly. It stopped again, looking tensely to the right and left, and crept forward, directly towards the boot of the vehicle. Very carefully, to avoid making any unnecessary noise, the figure opened the boot lid. Then the man pulled a torch from his jacket pocket and illuminated the entire boot. He soon found what he had been looking for. He held the earring in his hand and examined it closely. Then he switched off the torch and carefully closed the boot lid. That was our cue. Holmes thrust open the carriage door and we also drew our torches, with which I shone directly into the perpetrator's face. He raised his hands defensively in front of his head. Only when I lowered the beam of the torch slightly did we see who was standing before us. "Stuart Sanders!" I exclaimed. To be honest, I had expected the other brother. Holmes apparently not. Stuart Sanders, I knew it. "What are you doing here?" asked Sanders, completely perplexed. "Catching the Tiffany thief," Holmes replied to him. Stuart Sanders produced a forced laugh. "That's utter nonsense." "No, it isn't. Why else would you sneak into your own garage in the middle of the night and search the boot of your car for Tiffany's supposedly missing earring?" But I, stammered Stuart Sanders. "Why would I have wanted to kill her?" "Let me explain that to you. You knew about Tiffany's affair with Rick Hunter. You blackmailed her with it, didn't you? You'd tell her husband everything if she wouldn't be intimate with you. That's right, isn't it? However, Tiffany wouldn't be blackmailed. She had feelings for Hunter and wanted to stand by them. This drove you into a rage. You had a confrontation with her. You gave her a resounding slap. She lost her balance, fell badly, dead. Yes, that's how it was. I didn't want to kill her. You must believe me. It was an accident," whimpered Stuart Sanders. "It was manslaughter," said Holmes icily. "Watson, would you kindly inform Inspector Wolfford waiting at the gate? We have our culprit." "You said the earring believed to be lost. Tiffany didn't actually lose it in the boot at all, did she? That was all just a ruse." "That's right," admitted Holmes. Stuart Sanders clutched his head with both hands and reflected. "And all this because of an earring." You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Telltale Earring, The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes, Episode 10, based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production.